But I'm going to try to interpret that title as people realizing their independence, people like us realizing their independence, and their responsibility in the face of crisis. So first of all, the crises. Most of you will follow the what's happening in your own and other countries, and you will know that the world is not going well at the moment. There's a series of challenges which are deeper than they have been in the past, perhaps deeper than at any time since the last war, the last World War, 60, 70 years. And the promises, what seem to be the possibilities in the world, or in large parts of the world, in the 1980s, the 1990s, are at best being revised, often damaged, and sometimes destroyed. Some of the expectations that the world had, that people were told we would have in these years, depended on the collapse of communism, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in this country, former Yugoslavia. And the promise was that with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, the division in the world between the capitalist world and the communist world would usher in a new period in world history. There would be cooperation between East and West in a way there had not been before. There would be the spread of democracy and civil society, and that would spread from West to East and would bring people, societies, governments, countries together in a way which had not happened ever before in history. Europe, the European Union, would become, as Mikhail Gorbachev called it then, a common home. Europe, our common home. And not just for people who were usually considered European, but also for the people of the Soviet Union. What Gorbachev said was that Europe didn't end where the Soviet Union began, or should not end. It should take in the people of the Soviet Union, the people of Central and Western Europe in one common society with common values, common principles. And the European Union itself would steadily get bigger and bigger, would take in more and more countries, and would also become more united. So it would be both broader and more together, brought more together. Peaceful relations, peaceful ways of solving conflict would be the normal way of doing things in the world. And there were many, many people who thought this was a real new period. Perhaps especially well-known American commentators who wrote about this. Famously, Francis Fukuyama, in a book, an article he wrote at the end of the 1980s, spoke about the end of history. It's been misinterpreted, but he did mean that he thought that liberal democracy, democratic practice, and liberal society would spread. There was no competition to it. Communism had been another vision of the world, another way of running societies, another morality. But it had failed and collapsed, and now liberal democracy was taking over, and it would bit by bit spread. It had no opponent, no opposition. Thomas Friedman, who was best known commentator in the New York Times, spoke of social democratic practice, a social democratic regime spreading throughout the world, where you would have both capitalism and at the same time a kind of welfare state, social democratic safety nets on the model of Western Europe, model of France, Germany, Britain, so on. And that this also would be the way in which all countries would be run or would wish to be run, would try to become like that. So these were very high aims, very high ideals. People believed in them, worked for them, thought about them. The Western societies, including the United States, cut their armed forces. Both Russia, as it became after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the West cut the nuclear forces. There's a real spirit of something new happening and all kinds of possibilities happening. At the same time as that happened, apartheid between black and white was ending in South Africa, and the figure of Nelson Mandela, who'd been in prison for many years under apartheid, emerged to become the president, the first president of a democratic post-apartheid South Africa. So there was signs everywhere of a new start. So what has happened? What has happened since that explosion of hope a quarter of a century ago? What's it like today for people who are young today, people growing up today, but all of us of every generation who are still around today, both those of us who remember what these years were like and those who may have read about them and who are living through different times. First, many people here are Russian, and it would be good to have a discussion about how you see Russia. You will have different views. Most people in the West think that Russia has become much more aggressive. It has taken Crimea, which is mainly inhabited by Russian speakers, and it has assisted separatists in the east of Ukraine and in Donbass, what had been called New Russia. It's actively trying to destabilize the European Union. The European Union itself is very weak at the moment for a whole variety of reasons, but partly because the euro, the currency created for most of the members of the European Union, is going through a prolonged crisis and may again get worse. And the migrant crisis, migrants coming from North Africa, from Syria, from Iraq, from sub-Saharan Africa, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, flooding into Europe and causing enormous political and economic and social disruption. There's been a rise of far-right parties, which are very powerful and which are the most popular in France, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, growing in Germany, growing in Italy, and elsewhere. And Russia is helping these parties, is funding them and assisting them. And Russia, which had been under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, President Yeltsin, had become closer to the United States, which was the old enemy of the Soviet Union. Again, United States is seen really most of the time as an opponent, as an enemy. There's some collaboration, for example, in Syria, though that's very difficult, but mostly the two are again opponents in the world. opposing each other for influence in the Middle East, influence in Europe. In the latest elections in Russia, as you will know, President Putin's party, United Russia, has won a very convincing victory. And with it, in the Duma, the three parties which are closely allied to it, Just Russia, the LDPR, and the Communists, have also won places. None of the liberal parties, Yabloko and the others, have any representation at all. None got over 5%. So the parliament is very much for President Putin, and much of the commentary, both in Russia and in the West, has been, since the election at the weekend, much of the commentary has pointed to this victory in Parliament, the fact that the Duma is now again very much for the president, means that he is well set up to go for another election as president, which will be his fourth term as president in 2018. So he's on course for being president until then, and then another 5-year term after that. He's extremely popular. He's getting over 80% in the polls. And yet at the same time, the Russian economy has declined quite sharply for about 2 years or more. Mostly when economies decline, the prime minister or the president becomes unpopular. People won't vote for him. But actually, President Putin has become more popular at the same time as the economy has declined. Not because it's declined, but because he's seen as strong, he's seen as extending, bringing into Russia parts of the Soviet Union which should belong to it, many people think. Standing up against the West, especially against the United States, but also against America, and being a strong leader. I think Lev Gudkov is here. He will know better than I about the polls on President Putin. I think the Levada Center, some months ago, before it was declared as a foreign agent, did a poll which showed that when you ask ask a sample of Russians whether they prefer democracy or power, they would mainly answer power. The need to have a powerful president, a powerful country, a country which is feared and respected, is still regarded as the most important part of politics. It's what politics is about, and it's different from much of Europe. It's not different from the States. The United States also believes in power, so it believes in democracy as well, though it's doubtful if Donald Trump is a great Democrat, but he certainly believes in power. But much of the European Union thought that the days of power, hard military power, were over. And the European Union was built up on an assumption of soft power, cultural power, power to expand to other countries, to bring other countries in, and by doing so, making them part of a peaceful, developing, rich society or series of societies. The problem about that has been, in the last few years, that when you are opposed by somebody who's prepared to use hard power, military power, then you're a bit lost. And the struggle over Ukraine has made Europe look weak, which it was already, and has meant that Ukraine is poised between two blocks, one Russia, one Europe, unsure where to go, while at the same time Europe itself, the European Union, is unsure what to do. The vote for the Duma, as I say, took place at the same time as Russia was declining in the economy. The currency, the ruble, was depreciating against other currencies, other foreign currencies. A few days before the election, Alexei Navalny used a drone to photograph, a drone flying a bit above the ground, to photograph an enormous estate, which is used by the Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. And Navalny had a commentary on this, how much it cost, millions and millions, and how huge it was, how well protected it was. And that clearly was aimed at affecting the result of the election, but it doesn't seem to. As I said, the liberals, people who might support Navalny, got a low vote. At the same time as Russia has got stronger, so has China, in a different way. China, as you know, still has a communist government, a communist party, which wields power. Its economy for the last 10 years or more has grown very strongly. It's switched from being a wholly state-owned economy into being one which is quite to a large extent capitalist, free market, though with the party very much in control. And when President Xi Jinping came to power 3 years ago, he made it clear that he wanted the party, which in his view had become too detached from everyday life, he wanted it to be in control again. He wanted to go back, in some senses, to the age of Chairman Mao, especially in the media, in the news media. He decreed that the party must be in control of the media. The newspapers, television to an extent, had been a bit freer before he came. There was some investigative journalism, analysis, some critical journalism, especially in some newspapers. He said an end to that. We don't want that. We follow the Communist Party example, and the admiration which he said many Chinese journalists had for Western journalism, especially American journalism, must stop. We want journalism with Chinese characteristics. We want it to be under the control of the Communist Party. So you have two of the biggest countries in the world. China, of course, is by far the biggest. Russia is still a huge country in size, still is a large population, where strong authoritarian leaders are in command and are also popular. And they're popular, it seems, because they are seen to be in command. While in Europe, especially, you are seeing leaders like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who tries to run her own country but also tries to run Europe, who is now trailing in the polls behind the far-right party in regional elections. There is no elections until next year in Germany, but at the moment, because of the migrant crisis, because she allowed many migrants to come into Germany, she's become unpopular. President Hollande of France is extremely unpopular. He's had one term in office. He, like a Russian president, can run again. Nobody knows if he will or not, but everybody expects him to lose. The most popular politician in France is the far-right leader, Marine Le Pen. You will know that Britain, my country, came out of the European Union, or voted to come out of the European Union in a referendum. And so Brexit the exit from the European Union by Britain is now taking place. It's not happened yet. It might take 2 or 3 years. Some people think it won't happen. But the new Prime Minister has said Brexit means Brexit, though nobody quite knows what that means. And it will take the next 2 or 3 years to find out. In Italy, huge debt. Banks have got enormous amounts of bad debts and are trembling. The Prime Minister, young Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, is trying very hard to get growth, but hasn't. And indeed, Italy has had no growth, no economic growth for 16 years. It's been more or less flat. And is now beginning to suffer from it. So the wealthy big European states, relatively big European states, are in a crisis. In the United States, where there is growth, high employment, low unemployment, there is, as you know, an election coming up, and Donald Trump, who is a very wealthy man, property magnate, and a famous personality on television with a show called The Apprentice, who came into the race for the Republican Party nomination. Nobody thought he would get it. All the journalists thought he was a joke. He got the nomination of the Republican Party. He's now level in the polls with Hillary Clinton. And there's a real chance, a real possibility that he might win. Something thought inconceivable. I also still think it's inconceivable, but I'm beginning to have my doubts. So, crises in the democratic world, power and authority in the authoritarian world, in the Middle East, the countries of the Middle East. A civil war goes on, essentially, between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. The Sunnis are the majority. But many of the conflicts which now go on, not all, but many of them, take their root in this combat between these two Muslim forces. In Syria, millions of refugees, hundreds of thousands of dead, women and children very much included, the destruction of many of the cities, but the government and the president, Assad, is still in power after years and years of fighting, supported by Russia, and possibly, though it's still early days and fighting certainly hasn't given up, is now beginning to win back parts of the country that he had lost. In most of the Middle Eastern countries, apart from Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, warfare still goes on. The Arab Spring of 2012, 2013, which was supposed to be a liberation, is now well and truly past, and a very strong military dictatorship has taken the place of government in Egypt, the biggest and the most important of the Middle Eastern states. From some of the movements within the Middle East comes terrorism, extremist Islamist terrorism, but not just from there, also from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, within Russia and the former Soviet Union, from the Caucasus. And terrorism now frightens the citizens of all of Europe, but perhaps especially France, where the attacks have been the most frequent. And the groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and many others, though they have been battered by airstrikes and by fighting, still exist, can still mount terrorist attacks, and presumably will keep on doing so. And that's meant that the West is extremely fearful, afraid of bombs on planes, so that tourism has suffered, afraid of going to France. Many French Jews have left France because they're afraid of being attacked by French Muslims, as has happened. So within the societies themselves, fear has grown. And to say that the number of people who die from terrorism is many, many fewer than those who die in road accidents doesn't really matter. People are used to road accidents. They're not used to having people in the society who at some point may let off a bomb. So, pretty lousy world at the moment. Lots of crises. So what do independent people, what's the responsibility of independent people? It's difficult to see an end to many of these crises, especially in Europe. It's difficult to see how Europe can get out of the economic crisis, the migrant crisis, the disunity, the waves caused by Brexit. It may well be that what was an expectation, a commitment by many, many people after the war in Europe to construct a unified Europe where the countries, especially those which had been fighting each other, principally among them France and Germany, which had wars between them for well over a century, 2 centuries, would come together and ultimately unite and create a state called the United States of Europe. That's further away now than it's ever been. It's now, it seems to me, unlikely. Britain has signalled fairly sharply that it wants nothing to do with it. Actually, that's been its position all along. And Chancellor Merkel, the most powerful figure, as I said, has said, we don't want to try to come together more. All of the attempts to integrate, to bring us together, should be put to one side. Instead, we concentrate on doing things that would help people, especially reduce youth unemployment, which in some countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, of course, is 25–30% of young people have got no jobs and no prospect of getting jobs. Concentrate on these things, but leave aside any attempt to bring Europe together. And yet Europe, the European Union, was the great cause of many people within Europe. It's what this society here, Serbia, still wishes to join, what many of the former parts of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, either already have joined or will wish to join. It's what Ukraine has said it wishes to join, though it's very unlikely that it will happen soon. It's still, for many countries, especially former communist countries, it's still a beacon, it's still something that we want to be part of, and yet it weakens all the time. What I think people who are interested in politics, in current affairs, like you, people who come to conferences like this, who think about what's happening in the world, who wish things to change, perhaps, but we should discuss how you wish things to change. The example of the Moscow School of Civic Education, which is one of the sponsors of this conference, the example of the other sponsors of the conference itself, the examples of the various schools of civic education, the centers of civic politics, people coming together to discuss and debate and find out what to do. That example is extraordinarily important, more important now perhaps than it's been ever, even as this school is now part of the list, the growing list of foreign agents, and it can barely operate in Russia. But it's become extraordinarily important, and it must continue. It must continue to be a forum for open debate You may have read in the in this program one of the quotations in the program. Three quotations, three very well chosen quotations. One from Marcel Proust, the French novelist, who wrote his book À la recherche de temps perdu, nearly a century ago, more. He says, we don't receive wisdom, we must discover it for ourselves. We're not passive people who, well, of course we do receive wisdom, but we must also actively discover it, find out what wisdom is and what it means to us. He quotes Ralph Dahrendorf, who was a German political figure and scholar, who died a few years ago, who wrote, "Two things are important in life, purpose and meaning. A modern civic society isn't the worst place we can live our lives in, as long as the will to improve our way of life has not been extinguished. That is, as long as we continue to try to improve how we live and how others live." And then finally a famous quotation from Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher who worked for most of his life in what is now part of Russia, Kaliningrad. He wrote that, and this is the title of the conference, Sapere Aude, have the courage to use your own understanding. And that means to find out what you understand. Find out what wisdom is, what knowledge is. And then use it. Be active. All of these three quotations are essentially saying be active. Be active if one believes that a democratic society is a good way to live. If one believes that civil society, powerful civil societies, are a place where people can relate freely, more freely, without fear of people above, and can do things without a party or a government telling them to do things. If you believe that, if we believe that, then we have to be active. We have to be active both in the pursuit of knowledge, but also in the way in which knowledge is used. And that's been the purpose of this school for a quarter of a century. And I'm extraordinarily glad and think it very important that it should continue its work, and that conferences like this should be open forums for debate, for understanding, and for argument.